here. My name's Bokushu, and I don't know how it is where you are, but here it's sunny and blissfully quiet. No bombs, no bullets, no screams, no anguish that I can see, except perhaps a little right here. And like me, perhaps you've been feeling a little powerless as you read the news. Every day, every moment, another banner headline about another atrocity. It's really a bit overwhelming. And maybe one feeling you're having is helplessness. How can this be happening? Thousands of miles from here, and here I am sitting comfortably at home. No disruptions. Whole Foods continues to operate. Life is good in one way, and in another way, it's unbelievably bad. And I feel helpless. So if you are feeling helpless, it's my self-assigned task to help you with your helplessness and offer a way to use this crisis to inform our own behavior and thinking, which is in fact the very point of our being here together, is to look at our own behavior and thinking and to allow it to undo itself into a fresh, patternless, open space, which some call freedom. Personally, I think that word is very overrated and very poorly used in our political discourse lately. But let's use it for now as a placeholder for whatever it is that when we lose our own habits and problems, when we let them go, something else arises. There's a text that we haven't chanted for quite a long time called The Identity of Relative and Absolute. And in that text, the Sandokai, as it's called in Japanese, there is the sentence, "Do not judge by any standards." And this is not a talk about that phrase, but I do want to invite you to consider a couple of things. Standards, plural, doesn't say do not judge by any standard. It says do not judge by any standards. And when you work with these texts, a very careful reading is in order. So I wonder what you might make of that little s at the end of the word standard. But it does seem jarring in the context of what's happening in this world to be asked not to judge by any standards. So I also invite you to ask yourself if hating war is judging by any standards. There's also another translation, set up not your own standards, the idea that we set up standards and then judge by them. But if we don't set up standards, how do we make sense of or understand the nightmare that is unfolding in Ukraine right now. Our reason cannot help us make sense of it. Our feelings cannot help us to understand it. Thinking that all things are one cannot stop the bombings or feed the refugees. Believing in not knowing will not silence the drums of war or the advocates of violence in the Ukraine, in Russia, or the United States. We want a system. We want a plan to quell the nightmare and to end the chaos. But apparently there is no such system or plan. So what can we do? We can use the world's insanity to illuminate our own insanity. Russia, as I understand it, invaded Ukraine to punish the country for being oriented toward the West, for wanting to be a Western democracy and to join in Western institutions. And after Russia made the decision to punish Ukraine for those tendencies, the West punished Russia for invading Ukraine. They're not equivalent. I'm not drawing an equivalency between the punishment that Russia is inflicting on Ukraine and the punishment that the West is inflicting on Russia. But they are both punishments. And this pattern of punishing people and governments who displease us is ubiquitous in our culture. This is the default response that we all have to whatever we dislike, is that we punish it in one way or another. We set up a standard of behavior, a rule or a law, and when it is violated, we punish the violator. Have you noticed that this response is not working? Ukraine is just as defiant of Russia as ever, thank goodness, in my opinion. And alas, Russia is just as defiant of the West as it was before we imposed the sanctions. The punishments aren't doing the job. And what about in our lives? Are the punishments doing the job for us? That's really what I want to talk about, is how we use punishment in our own lives and how futile that's been for us and what we might do about that, how we might be less helpless around that. Standards are supposed to demarcate where violations begin, and they are used to justify punishment when the violations happen. And because they don't seem to be working, this may be why, in part, the identity of relative and absolute says, do not judge by any standards, because they do seem to be an exercise in futility or worse. So how are we to live together? This does seem to be the eternal question, doesn't it? How are we to live with ourselves? Well, to live together, we must organize ourselves. We can't live in nothingness, as our study text Shodoka points out. Organization requires boundaries, and boundaries mean rules, and rules define violations. If we don't live in emptiness, ignoring cause and effect, as Shodoka tells us we must not do, we must have structures, boundaries, and rules. So we need these things to organize our communal life, but the trick is to not create suffering while we use these things to live our communal life. That is, in fact, the origin of this practice, that Buddha saw that there was suffering in the world and that there was a way out of the suffering. So instead of creating it, maybe we could find a way out of it. We are very interested in reducing suffering in this practice. And our cultural default of punishment usually creates more suffering than it prevents. Things must be this way, or you will pay for it. If I don't get what I want, you will suffer for it. That is again and again what happens, on a large scale and on a small scale in our culture. Sally has a birthday party. Jenny isn't invited. Jenny gets mad. And when Jenny organizes a benefit, Sally isn't invited. Sally and Jenny's children stop speaking to each other. One of the kids picks a fight with the other, gives him a bloody nose. This stuff happens all the time. Petty bickering, punishment begetting punishment. How do we escape this pattern of punishment? There is a tool called nonviolent communication. And I know that some people in this community don't like nonviolent communication. I've seen some objections to it in comments. And maybe it's a little violent of me to say so, but I don't care what you think of nonviolent communication. Let's just use what we can and forget the rest. So in it, one thing that I learned that's very valuable to me is the difference between a request and a demand. So the defining feature of a demand is that if it is not met, there will be punishment for it. Meanwhile, a request is simply an open expression of a preference, which allows fully for the person who is being asked to do something to say no, and to say no without any consequences. That's the difference between a request and a demand. Request, no punishment. Demand, if you don't do what I want, you will suffer for it. What if we framed our relationship to reality, to other people, to situations, to nations, as requests instead of demands? What if we allowed fully for the possibility that the person to whom we are expressing our preference will say no, and that no is a perfectly legitimate answer, and that there will be no punishment for saying no? I really think this world would be completely transformed if people could simply learn to skillfully say no and to skillfully receive that answer. Think about what would happen if we were all able to do that all the time. It would be the world would be unrecognizable. And I don't know what the banner headlines would be in such a world. Tree on the corner dies. Something like that. And this punishment is not just externally directed. Aren't we always making demands of ourselves? I should be better. I should be kinder. I should be more grateful, more generous. Or next time, he won't be able to walk all over me. I'll fix his wagon. I'm not a doormat. He can't do that to me. So we're always asking ourselves in a very insistent way to do things differently, to do them better, to be stronger, to be more independent, whatever it is that we feel we lack, or whatever it feels that we have too much of, we're always badgering ourselves to be different. And it's not a request, it's a demand. And what's the punishment? Well, self-loathing, for one, feeling less than. And often, in the case of world leaders, using that facade of I'm better than everyone else to cover over the self-loathing, to cover over the feeling of inferiority and inadequacy. So it's very possible that in this attack on Ukraine, Putin is also working with his own self-loathing, his own feeling of inadequacy. I'm not asking you to like Putin, but can you notice the similarity between him and the rest of us? Just a little bit? The needle that we're trying to thread in this life is to have a preference without turning it into a demand, without inflicting punishment when the demand is not met. Have a preference, but that's all. Don't punish yourself or other people if the demand isn't met. Don't go to war because you don't get invited to a party. Can we dial down the clinging? The Buddha said the desire is the cause of suffering. I don't think any of us here are going to stop desiring things, including desiring peace in the Ukraine. Sorry, I keep saying the Ukraine. I know that's wrong. That's a habit. My problem. I won't punish myself for saying the when I shouldn't, but I do apologize for it. Can we dial down the clinging? Can we have our preferences without going wild when they aren't satisfied? So the way to do this is to say to oneself, this is what I want. But if I don't get it, it's perfectly okay. No is a perfectly acceptable answer, and I need to be prepared for that. And it doesn't make me worse as a person or the world more horrible as a place. Can we do that? Can we do that kind of mental gymnastic? Can we accommodate the world just as it is? Recognizing that we, in fact, are the world, or rather that the world is us. And so instead of setting ourselves up in opposition to the world, can we just accommodate what's going on? Or if we have a wish for something else to be going on, to not inflict punishment when that wish does not get met. I mean, I wish I could wake up tomorrow and the photographs of burning buildings and rubble and people dead on the street were no longer in the paper. That would be great. But guess what? It isn't going to happen. I'm sorry to say. It helps to remember that the person with the preferences is completely made up. This thing that I'm touching, this is real, but all the identity, all the ideas about defending itself, promoting itself, all the anxiety I'm having right now, what are they thinking? I'm giving this talk, I'm making an ass of myself. All that is completely made up. It's nonsense. So we take these preferences and desires so seriously, but the thing that has them doesn't exist. Can we just remember that? I didn't say it would be easy, but it's definitely worth a try. So particularly with respect to Ukraine, we want peace, but it won't do to demand peace. It won't do. No less a person than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his Christmas sermon on peace, December 24th, 1967, said, "One day we must come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal we seek, but that it is a means by which we arrive at that goal. We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means. Means and ends must cohere, because the end is pre-existent in the means, and ultimately destructive means cannot bring about constructive ends. To make a demand is destructive. We can live differently from Putin. If we want peace, we can create it ourselves and not yield to our deeply ingrained habits of demanding what we want and punishing people and ourselves when it doesn't happen. None of this precludes our taking positive steps as we see it, giving money for Ukraine relief, protesting the violence, writing letters, anything we can think of, making camouflage nets if you can sew. None of this prevents that. And we should engage as we choose in helping people who are oppressed and under attack. I'd like to close my talk with a quote from our study text, Shadoka, since this is the last week of that text. And the text says, "Ah, the degenerate materialistic world. People are unhappy. They find self-control difficult. In the centuries since Shakyamuni, false views are deep. Demons are strong. The Dharma is weak. Disturbances are many." I kind of think that's a crock of shit. The Dharma is not weak. The degeneracy, the materialism, the unhappiness, the lack of self-control, the false views, and especially the demons. These are none other than the Dharma itself. These are the fuel for our practice. These illuminate what we can do in ourselves to transform this world. If you're feeling helpless, as I often am myself these days, just look right here, or I should say right there, because there's lots of great stuff that can be undone in that. We can de-Putinize ourselves. Let's do that together as we embark on this wonderful last week of our winter ongo. Please join me in doing urban session, and especially in coming in 1 week to see our glorious Shuso Hosen. Thank you for being here.